So here we are to talk about our second system, and that's going to be the circulatory system. So the circulatory system has a very important role in the body, and it actually acts to really tie together all the systems we talk about and even some of the systems that we don't. So I want to show you this really quick diagram here. We've already talked a little bit about the digestive system. So this is like a great representation of not necessarily just even your body, but a lot of mammals' bodies. So here we can see the digestive system is like one big long tube as you go through from beginning to end. We're going to talk about the respiratory system, which is represented over here. That respiratory system helps to bring oxygen in and to take waste, CO2, out. And then in grade 12, you're going to talk more about the excretory system. The excretory system is a way that you can get rid of waste within your body and get rid of it in the form of liquid waste or urine. So overall, you can see that these three major systems actually are all linked by the circulatory system. So the circulatory system is actually running in the middle here, and you can see that it's actually responsible for absorbing nutrients and carrying them to the body cells, and it's also responsible for excreting waste into this excretory system. It's responsible for picking up oxygen and discarding carbon dioxide into the lungs, and it delivers all of those things to cells. So it's really the thing that ties everything together between all of these systems. A little bit about circulatory systems. We're going to talk about specifically the human circulatory system today, but I want to keep making comparisons to other animal systems because there's actually a lot of things in common. All animals have three parts to the circulatory system. They have some sort of circulatory fluid or blood. In humans, it's called blood. In animals, it could be called something different. It's got tubes. So in our case, it's blood vessels. And it's got some sort of muscular pump. In our case, it's our heart. So I want to show you the difference between two different circulatory systems here. One is called the open and the other is called the closed circulatory system. So here, let's take a look at the closed one first. We've got our muscular pump, our heart, and that's going to pump our fluid, our blood throughout. So it's pumping it through here. And it's pumping it through our veins. So you can see the three different components. You've got the heart, you've got the fluid, the blood, and the blood's moving through the veins. One thing I want to point out here, in a closed circulatory system, the blood is separated from what we call the interstitial fluid. So people always think if you cut yourselves open, there's going to be blood everywhere. Everyone thinks they're all filled with blood. Your blood in your body is actually contained in your veins. Outside of your veins or your blood vessels is something called an interstitial fluid. It's like a clear body cavity fluid. So you're actually not filled with blood. Your blood is contained within veins because humans have a closed circulatory system. Another great example of a closed circulatory system is our friend the earthworm here. Some other animals have what's called an open circulatory system. An open circulatory system is seen in a grasshopper. So you still have your muscular pump. You still have your fluid moving throughout. In this case, we call it hemolymph, not blood. But that fluid actually moves through veins, but then it opens up to the entire body cavity. So you can see that there are some veins in our grasshopper, but then eventually it opens up to the entire body cavity. It can flow through the entire body cavity, and then it'll enter back into blood vessels to go back into the heart. So we have two different strategies here. Both contain the same parts, pump, vessels, and blood or fluid. Here we've got the open, and then in humans, that's what we're going to study today. We've got the closed. In a closed circuit, which is what we have, that's our cardiovascular system. In humans, we have something that's called a chambered heart. So you can see an actual anatomical heart here. Looks pretty different than the cute little heart cartoons that you see on Valentine's. We have two different types of chambers. The first type of chamber is called the atrium. The atrium are at the top here, and they receive blood. So you might have heard of a big atrium in a nice fancy building that you go into, or some very large houses have atrium. An atrium, that just means like a receiving room. So an atrium is a spot that you receive something. It's like the first chamber that you step into. So that's the same in your heart, where you're actually just receiving the blood from different parts of the body. The ventricles, on the other hand, pump blood out. So the ventricles are on the bottom, and they're responsible for giving that nice big push that's going to pump blood out and push it throughout the entire body. Your heart structure, you also have a wall separating what we call the left and the right side of the heart. So if we go back up here, we can see this nice big thick wall. This is called a septum, and we have the left side of the heart and we have the right side of the heart. Both of those actually do different things. So we have that nice big thick septum, that wall, that's going to separate the heart into two different sides because each of those sides do different things. Each side has a thin-walled atrium. So again, if we go back up here, we've got our atrium as at the top, and you can see here it's got very thin walls. So we've got our atrium on this side, we've got our atrium on this side, made up of thin walls. Each side also has a more muscular ventricle that's going to pump blood. So if we go back up here, we've got our ventricle here. We can see it's thicker. And then at the bottom, we can see our ventricle here. We can see on the left side of the heart, it's actually the thickest. And we're going to tell you why in a second. So the reason that the ventricles have so much thicker walls is because they're more muscular and they actually have to withstand greater pressure. They're going to pump the blood out. So there's a greater pressure in the ventricles than there are in the atria. So if we are going to take a look at the mammal heart, this is actually labeled. You do have this diagram, so please make sure that you label it. So here we have the left atrium, and you can see a little valve that blood's going to flow through. And we have the right atrium, and we've got a little valve that blood flows through. We've got the right ventricle at the bottom here. You can see that nice muscular section. And you can see the left ventricle down here, and the left ventricle is incredibly muscular. You've got that septum that's dividing the middle of the heart, and we actually have our biggest blood vessel here, our arteries at the very top. This is the aorta. You might be yelling at me right now saying that this is actually left, this is actually right. This diagram is not wrong, it's not inverted. What it's meant to do is that when you actually label your diagram on your heart, you should be able to pick it up, turn it around, and hold it to your heart, and that's actually what it's gonna look like. So we actually label the heart backwards. I understand that this is on the left, but when you hold this diagram up to your own heart, that's gonna be your right chamber, and this one here is going to be your left chamber. That's why we flip it anytime that we label the heart. Let's take a closer look now at the mammalian heart. So you don't have this diagram, but I do like to show it to you because you're going to see this again in grade 11 when we look at this in more detail. And it really just shows you all the different parts of the heart. So you can see that we actually have blood flowing in to the heart on this side. So blood flows in to the right side of the heart. It comes in from lots of different spots. So we have this anterior vena cava. So that's carrying blood from over top. We have our our posterior vena cava down here. That's carrying blood in from the bottom. So blood's entering from either the top of the heart, top of the body, or the bottom of the body, and it's coming into this right atria here, this receiving chamber. This here is actually valves. We're going to talk about those valves a little bit more in detail. This is called our atrioventricular valve, and what it makes sure happens is that blood only flows in one direction. It's very important that blood flows through one direction in your body and not the opposite direction. So this valve is going to make sure that blood can go from the atria to the ventricles, but it can't get back into the atria. So blood's going to go through our atrioventricular valve into our right ventricle. It's then going to get pumped out what we call our pulmonary artery. So it's going to go through our pulmonary artery. Pulmonary actually means lungs. So this blood is getting pumped out to our lungs. Notice that on this side, it's blue, and notice that on this side, it's red. Blood on that side is not actually blue or red. I have a video about that later that you can watch. What this is representing though is that blood coming back in from the body, we call it deoxygenated. So at that point, it doesn't have any oxygen. It's delivered all its oxygen to the body cells. So it wants to go back to the lungs in order to pick up more oxygen. So this pulmonary artery is going to flow it into the lungs. Next up, we have our pulmonary veins down here going into our left atria. So our pulmonary veins is blood coming back from the lungs. That blood is going to have oxygen and be ready to be delivered to the body. So we represent this side as red. So once it goes into this left atria, it's going to flow into our left ventricle down here. Now the left ventricle, again, is very thick and very muscular. That's because it has to pump blood all around your body. This side is only pumping blood to your lungs. So that's not far, right? Think about where your heart is. Think about where your lungs are. They're pretty close. This side is pumping blood all over your body, including to the very tips of your toes. So it's got to give a nice big push in order to actually get that blood out to your body. So that blood is going to flow through this aorta. Notice this aorta looks like it's very thick and it's very muscular. That's because the blood coming out of here is at an incredibly high pressure. Again, you have one push to try to get your blood all the way to the tips of your toes and to the tips of your fingers. So there's an incredible amount of pressure coming out of here. So we need to make sure that we can withstand this pressure. So that's, again, more of a grade 11 detail, but you can actually see how all the different parts of the heart can come together to make a pretty fantastic thing happen. So let's focus on a couple of these ideas that I think are going to be important. So the first thing we want to look at is these blood vessels. So I used a couple of these terms before. Let's talk about the 3 blood vessels that you can have in your body. The 3 types of blood vessels are called arteries, veins, and capillaries. I use this term in the digestive system, and I just mentioned these 2 terms here. So they're all different, and they all look different, and they all serve a different function. Arteries help to carry blood away from the heart. So arteries carry blood away from the heart. So for example, we have our artery here, our aorta, taking it to the body. We also have our artery here, our pulmonary artery, that's taking it to the lungs. We've got our veins here. Our veins return blood back to the heart. So if you look back on this diagram, our veins are what's feeding into our atria. We have our pulmonary veins here, and then we also have veins that are coming from, so we have pulmonary veins, and then we have the anterior vena cava. That's all feeding veins back into your atria. Your last type of blood vessel is your capillaries, and that's the point of gas exchange. So your capillaries are actually at body cells. They're incredibly thin, and that's where gas is actually leaving to go to the cells. It's also where nutrients are leaving to go to the cells, and it's where the blood is picking up waste. So it's the actual point of exchange between blood and the body cells. So if we were going to look at how these go in order, we've got our arteries. Our arteries, you can see here, are many layers and are incredibly thick. That's, again, to withstand the incredible amount of pressure that's coming from the heart. Arteries then get smaller into arterioles. This is almost just like an intermediate step before we get to capillaries. Capillaries are incredibly small. They're incredibly thin. Actually, many capillaries are 1 cell thick. This is going to allow more efficient exchange. So at the site of the cell, you've got your capillaries. Then here you've got your venules. Your venules are really just an intermediate step between your capillaries and your veins. Then we get to our veins. You can see that the veins here are thicker, are wider, and are actually thinner on the outside. So look at how the walls of the veins are thinner than the walls of the arteries. That's because there's less pressure in the veins, because it's that blood that's actually returning it back to your heart. So as blood comes back to your heart, it's flowing much slower, and it's got much less pressure in it. Okay, so we're going to look at these in a bit more detail now. So arteries, again, arteries are built for high pressure. Since they carry blood away from the heart, they have these thicker walls to withstand that greater pressure. Veins are built for low pressure flow. So they have thinner walls. You can see a vein here has thinner walls. This is actually a vein in your calf carrying blood from your feet back up to your heart. In order to account for that lower flow, they have something that's called valves. So valves are like a one-way flow. So valves are like 2 flaps that look like this. Valves will allow fluid coming from one direction, so they'll open from one direction, but they won't allow fluid from another direction. They're going to push against each other. They're going to push close. So larger veins have many valves. This allows blood flow to only flow towards the heart. So for example, you can see the valves in your feet. So the blood's going to push through this direction. It's not going to be able to push back through these valves. It prevents blood from pooling in your feet. Oftentimes when individuals get older, they get leaky valves. So oftentimes you might see grandparents or older individuals that have those swollen feet. Swollen feet is just caused by leaky valves and the accumulation of blood against gravity. So we can see here the difference between arteries and veins. So take a second and try to guess which one's which. I'm hoping you guessed this was arteries and this was a vein. This is an artery. We can tell because it has that thicker wall, whereas our vein here has that thinner wall. The last one is our capillaries, and the capillaries are built for gas exchange. One sec. I'm back. My dog wanted to go outside. So capillaries are built for exchange. So since they're built for exchange, they have incredibly thin walls. It's actually only in the endothelium or skin cells. So that's going to allow the gas, nutrients to pass through easily, as well as the waste. So it's going to enhance exchange across the capillaries. Your body or your circulatory system is said to be two systems in one. The left and the right side actually do different things. So I mentioned this before. This isn't just written down in writing. So the right side of your heart pumps blood to the lungs. Why it's going to the lungs is to exchange CO2 for O2. So it wants to get rid of any carbon dioxide that was picked up from your cells as waste. And it also wants to pick up oxygen to deliver to your cells. This is called the pulmonary circuit. So anytime you hear the word pulmonary, I want you to think of lungs. So the pulmonary circuit, or the right side of your heart, goes to your lungs to get rid of carbon dioxide and to pick up oxygen. The left side of your heart is going to pump oxygen-rich blood around your body. We call this the systemic circuit. So when I say systemic, I want you to think about the rest of the body. So the left side is going to receive that oxygenated blood from the lungs, and it's going to deliver it to the rest of the body. Blood moving through the heart is called the cardiac circuit. So you do have just blood flowing around the heart as well too. This is required because the heart itself is an organ and it requires blood. So you've also got this third system, this cardiac circuit, that we don't necessarily label. So you've got this diagram here. I want you to label it as well too. And you can just see the pulmonary circuit. So again, the pulmonary circuit is feeding from the right side of the heart to the lungs. So here, this blue represents the fact that it's deoxygenated blood. It goes to the lungs, it picks up oxygen, and it goes back to the heart. Now it's on the left side of the heart. So now it's considered to be the systemic circuit. So it's going to flow from the left side of the heart to the body, and it's going to deliver that oxygen. Then flowing back to the heart, this is now deoxygenated blood. This is because the oxygen has been delivered to the blood cells. It goes back into the heart, ready to enter back into the pulmonary circuit. So we have our two systems. We have our pulmonary circuit and we have our systemic circuit down here. So this is just in greater detail. It walks you through exactly every single step. Again, this is more of a grade 11 detail, but if you're really interested in biology or the circulatory system, this is a great diagram for you to look at. Now let's talk a little bit about heart valves. So we already introduced the idea of the valves to you when we talked about veins. Capillaries also have valves, but your heart has valves as well too. So since we have those two circuits in one, I'm going to go back here. You don't want blood flowing backwards. You don't want oxygen poor blood going back to the body cells. That's no good. And you don't want this blood going back this way. The only reason your circulatory system works is because it flows through this system constantly. It's a perfect direction to drop off oxygen and then pick up more oxygen. So valves keep blood going in one direction and it prevents backflow. What they actually are flaps of connective tissue. So you can see your valves in your heart here. We call these atrioventricular valves. This is because they're between the atria and the ventricles. So we have our atrioventricular valves on both sides. We also have what are called semilunar valves here. The semilunar valves help to differentiate between the ventricles and the arteries that are carrying blood away. So our ventricles and our arteries, we don't want it flowing back from our arteries into our ventricles. So the semilunar valves help to protect that. Let's talk about what a heartbeat or your heart sounds are. So maybe you've heard before your stethoscope. So I hope you've had this opportunity to actually hear your own heartbeat where you have a stethoscope. Your heartbeat is actually controlled within your heart itself. So it's actually not controlled necessarily by your brain. It's actually electrical activity within your heart itself. So we have two nodes or bundles of neurons. We have this sinal atria node up here, and we have our atrioventricular node down here. These two bundles of nerves are actually what control the heartbeat. So they control the contractions of the ventricles, which is what actually causes your heartbeat. So if you have issues with your heartbeat, oftentimes what we'll do, if your heart stops, you can see the electric paddles. What the electric paddles are meant to do is it's meant to restart these nodes, these bundles of electricity. So sometimes your heart goes into cardiac arrest, it'll stop beating, and simply a shock of electricity is often enough to override it and to cause this heart to restart again. Some individuals actually have pacemakers with defibrillators built right in. My sister-in-law has one of those, where she actually has a pacemaker which helps to set the pace of her heart, and if it starts fluttering too much or if it gets too out of control, she actually will receive a small shock. It actually restarts her heart and restarts these sinoatrial and atrioventricular nodes. So the heartbeat, what does it actually sound like? Your heartbeat actually sounds like a lub-dub sound. So your heartbeat is actually caused by the closing of valves. So that sound that you hear, that lub-dub that you hear through a stethoscope, is actually the closing of the valves and the connective tissues hitting against each other. So lub is actually the recoil of blood against a closed atrioventricular valve. So we've got our atrioventricular valve again up here. So that lub, that first noise, is the sound of blood splashing against this valve as it closes. The dub is a recoil of blood against the semilunar valve. So remember, the semilunar valve is here. So that second heartbeat, that dub sound, is the sound of blood sloshing against this valve here as it closes. So lub is blood flowing from here to here, and then the valve closing. Dub is the blood flowing from here to here and the sound closing. So it's two different sounds, blood moving from the atria to the ventricles and blood moving from the ventricles out into the arteries, out into the body. You might have heard of someone that has a heart murmur before. My sister-in-law had a heart murmur as well. What a heart murmur is a defect in the valves. It causes almost a hissing sound. So it means that your valves aren't working totally properly. And what is happening is you get blood squirting backwards through the valve. So you get a steady stream of blood squirting backwards. It almost sounds like a hissing sound. And that's how you represent a heart murmur. Sometimes it can be very dangerous. Sometimes it can be totally benign as long as they're monitored. Let's talk a little bit about the cardiac cycle. What the cardiac cycle is a complete sequencing of pumping. So it's that lub and that dub sound together. So the first part of the cardiac cycle is the heart contracting and pumping. So again, we have to push blood out to the body. So we have to contract. So that's the first part of the cardiac cycle. And then really important, people forget this part. The heart then has to relax and the chambers have to fill with blood. So the heart's going to pump. That's going to push all the blood out towards the body. And then the next really important part is that heart has to relax. If it doesn't relax, it's not going to fill with blood and you're not going to be able to pump more blood to the rest of your body. So your heart's going to contract, push blood out, then it's going to relax, fill with more blood, contract, push blood out, relax. And this sequence together is called the cardiac cycle. We have two different names for this. The contraction phase, we call that systole. That's when your ventricles are pumping blood out. Your relaxation phase, so when your heart's reacting, we call that diastole, and that's when your atria are refilling. So you might have heard of these terms in medical shows. Systole is when we push things out, contraction. Diastole is when we we relax, and we allow that blood to flow back into your atria. So we've talked about vessels in detail and what those vessels look like around your body. We've talked about heart, your pump in detail, and the different components of your heart and the cardiac cycle. Now we're going to talk about the components of blood. So oftentimes people just think blood is blood and it's this red liquid and they get really squeamish around it. But blood actually has very distinct components that you can separate out. Each component does something different. A couple fun facts though. The average human has at least 5 liters of blood. So think about those liter Coke bottles we talked about before. Think about 5 of them. You could fill those with blood in your body right now. What blood is the transporting fluid, and it carries substances to all different parts of the body. You have 4 different components to your blood. Those components are plasma, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. So we're going to talk about them in detail. So people always think your blood looks like this. If you actually centrifuge your blood, so that means spinning it around really fast, you can divide it into its different components. So plasma makes up the most part of your blood. That's here. This is like a yellow liquid. Red blood cells are down here. Red blood cells are actually solid. So everyone thinks that your blood is liquid. Your blood is actually suspension. So your blood is liquid with solid parts floating into it. So your red blood cells are down here. They make up anywhere from 40 to 45% of your blood. Then you have your white blood cells, make up about 1%, and the platelets make up the rest. So each of these actually has a very specific job. So we're going to talk about what each of them does. This is actually a great microscope picture where you can see different components of the blood. The plasma would be the liquid. Everything is flowing between. These big globular things, these are white blood cells. These things that kind of almost look like donuts, these are red blood cells. And these kind of like spidery things back here, those are platelets. So if you actually look at your blood under a microscope, it actually looks like this compared to just a fluid flowing through. Your plasma is actually just a liquid part of your blood. It doesn't have so much of a job, but it is very important because, again, your blood is flowing through your veins. So if your blood didn't have a liquid component, it wouldn't be able to flow. You actually can just donate plasma rather than just donating blood as well too. So when you donate blood, they sometimes centrifuge it out, take the plasma through plasma donations. Platelets are next. So I like to throw this kind of really fun word at you. These prefixes often mean something. So thrombocyte is what we actually call platelets. So if you go to study on medicine later, anytime you hear the word thrombo, they're talking about platelets. This is a microscope picture of what your platelets look like. They are tiny, they produce tiny fibrin threads. So think about little threads coming out of these kind of little blobby things here. What they do is they trap blood cells. Platelets are actually what's important for healing. So platelets will actually come in and they will help you form a scab on your skin, which will help it heal. So they're important for clotting as well too, blood clotting. So if you have a cut, you don't want to bleed forever. You don't want to bleed to death. So you want to close that cut. So what will happen is platelets will be delivered to the site of your cut. Platelets will actually form thread-like material. So you might have seen almost like thread-like little things coming out of your scabs, right? Or like a thread-like material, thread-like structure to your scab is what I'm trying to say. So platelets will come through and they'll actually trap those red blood cells. By trapping those red blood cells, the red blood cells will stick, they will dry, and it'll help to form a scab. That's going to allow that surface of that skin to go ahead and repair itself, and it's going to stop any additional blood from leaking out. White blood cells are called leukocytes. So leukemia is actually a disorder related to white blood cells. It's a cancer of your bone marrow and your white blood cells. Your white blood cells are your body's defense, and they are part of your immune response. So you'll study these a little bit more in grade 11 and 12. Fascinating stuff. And these white blood cells are actually able to recognize invaders, and they'll actually go through and they'll attack invaders within your body, and they can help to fight off infection. And the last and possibly the most important is our red blood cells. They're called erythrocytes. So you can see that they are this flat dish shape here. The reason they're this flat dish shape is they actually have no nucleus. So they're the only cell within your body that's not able to go through mitosis or reproduce on its own because they have no nucleus, no DNA to pass on. The reason they have no nucleus is they are trying to carry as much oxygen as possible. So they actually give up the nucleus in the middle of the cell in order to be able to carry more oxygen to your body cells. So again, we talked about how one of the main important components of the circulatory system is dropping off oxygen. This is actually what drops off your oxygen is your red blood cells. So they transport oxygen to and from blood. How they actually transport oxygen is they contain heme, which contains iron. So you might have heard of iron being very important before for your circulatory system. That's because the iron in the red blood cells is actually acting almost like an oxygen magnet. The iron will bind oxygen and help to carry it to the body cells. So if you don't have enough iron in your body, you don't have enough iron in your red blood cells, and you're going to get, they call it anemic, you're not going to be able to deliver enough oxygen to your body, and you're going to feel tired and fatigued, and you can get some other symptoms along with anemia as well too. So that's the circulatory system, really big system. We divide it into different parts. So we talked about our blood vessels, we talked about our heart, and then we also talked about our components of blood.